So, what happens when a country that was once one of the richest in its region just spirals into a decade long crisis? Well, in Venezuela, the answers are messy. They're super polarized and they affect millions of lives every single day. Let's try to unpack the anatomy of this really profound political and economic turmoil.
To really get a sense of the scale here, you have to start with the human cost. And this number, nearly 8 million, that's how many Venezuelans have actually left the country. I mean, think about that. It's a quarter of the entire population. It's one of the largest displacement crises in modern history. So, what on earth could be driving an exodus this massive?
Okay, so where do we even begin to unravel all this? Well, to get to the heart of it, we've got to look at the event that really brought the current crisis to a boiling point, the presidential election of 2024. And believe me, this was not just another election. This was a political flashpoint that basically ripped open all the deep fractures running through the nation.
Right, so in July 2024, Venezuelans head to the polls. The National Electoral Council comes out and declares the incumbent Nicolás Maduro the winner. But almost immediately, the opposition cries foul. They claim they won by a landslide, and they point out that the number of uncounted votes was way bigger than Maduro's supposed margin of victory. The government's response? They refused to release detailed results, blaming a hack. And as you can imagine, that triggered nearly 1,000 protests all across the country, and not just in the usual opposition areas, but, and this is key, in poorer neighborhoods too.
This whole situation brings up a huge question. Is the government's response a legitimate defense of its sovereignty, or is it just brutal repression? As we're about to see, the perspectives on this could not be more different.
To get one side of the story, you can look right here. This is the cover of a report from the United Nations Independent Fact-Finding Mission. After the election, they launched a full-blown investigation into alleged human rights violations, and, well, their findings paint a pretty grim picture.
And this is where you see two completely conflicting realities just crash into each other. On one side, you've got the UN's findings. They're talking about a systematic state policy to silence any opposition, with over 2,000 people detained and documented cases of torture and enforced disappearances. But then, on the other side, you have the government's rationale. They argue these actions are a necessary defense, a response to decades of US-backed attempts at regime change. They point to a whole history of coups and assassination attempts. They don't call it repression, they frame it as taking the gloves off to protect the nation from foreign aggression.
But, the political crisis is only one piece of the puzzle. It's all happening on top of a decade-long economic collapse that is just staggering in its scale. And no surprise, just like with the politics, the explanations for why this happened are miles apart.
Just let this number sink in for a second. 75%. Between 2014 and 2022, Venezuela's economy shrank by over 3/4. I mean, an economic implosion of that size is almost unheard of in a country that isn't actively at war. So the obvious question is, how could this possibly happen?
So once again, we have these two competing stories. One argument points inward, to internal causes, decades of mismanagement, and almost complete reliance on oil for money, and these really flawed currency controls that apparently allowed an estimated $300 billion to just vanish. But the other argument places the blame squarely on the outside, specifically on crippling U.S. sanctions. They point to 2017, when Venezuela was banned from borrowing in U.S. markets, and then 2019, when the sanctions hit the oil industry directly, basically creating what critics call an economic war that just choked off any chance of recovery.
Now, to really wrap your head around this argument about sanctions and foreign interference, you just can't look at Venezuela in a vacuum. We kind of have to zoom out and look at the bigger picture, the broader history of U.S. foreign policy, not just in the region, but all over the world.
To understand this deep-seated suspicion, you really have to look at the history books. This timeline shows a clear pattern of U.S. interventions over the last 70 years or so, from Iran and Guatemala all the way to Chile and Libya. For the Maduro government and its supporters, this isn't just some academic history lesson. It is the lens through which they see every single action the United States takes today. And that history directly shapes how they see modern threats. For example, when the U.S. floats the idea of a potential naval blockade, it's heard as something way more serious than just political pressure. Because, under international law, that specific action has a very, very serious definition. So, the UN General Assembly literally defines a naval blockade as an act of aggression. To put it simply, it's not just a sanction, it's considered an illegal use of force. And this is so critical because under international law, an act of aggression gives the country being blockaded the right to respond in self-defense, which, as you can guess, dramatically raises the stakes of the whole standoff.
Okay, so here we are. Was it a stolen election or a defended democracy? An economy destroyed by mismanagement or by foreign warfare? With these deeply dug in, totally opposing realities, where does that leave Venezuela today? Is there any common ground at all?
So here's one perspective put forward by the academic Gabriel Hetland. He argues that the government has totally abandoned its populist roots. And in this view, Maduro has basically created a predatory state, a system where a small, corrupt elite gets rich while the majority of people suffer, and U.S. pressure has nothing to do with it. But then, of course, you've got the counter-argument from analysts like Steve Elner. This view doesn't necessarily let the government off the hook, but it insists that you have to look at the context. It argues that Maduro has faced challenges, from crashing oil prices to intense foreign aggression, that are way bigger than anything his predecessor ever had to deal with. And that makes just condemning him, well, kind of misleading. And just to make things even more complicated, there's a really fascinating third view. And this one comes from within the Venezuelan left. Groups like Comunes, they actually reject both sides. They see Maduro's government and the right-wing opposition as two sides of the same coin. They argue both have completely abandoned the Venezuelan people and sold out to big money, both at home and abroad. And all of that leaves us with this final, really tough question. When a nation is trapped between what many of its own people see as a predatory state and what others see as an imperialist siege, what does a path forward even look like? Honestly, there are no easy answers here.